This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times no matter when.
Morning, all. Good morning, and welcome to Chapter 5. Now, at this point, we have our guy out of his childhood. We have him out of his youthful days. We even have him out of his life as a Viennese freelancing musician, still trying to make himself known. As of last week's class, Johannes Brahms became a superstar. He became a rock star. The German Requiem, Deutsches Requiem, made his name all over Europe. Bit by bit, people started performing it, and before you know it, the guy was a household name. So, at this point, all of the pieces were in place. He was living in Vienna. His music was sought after. He was selling music very well. His name on a composition would help sell it. It arrived. Now what? What do you do after something like the German Requiem? What do you do? What do you do? Well, there was the 500-pound gorilla in the room, which had been there ever since he was a young man. And of course, that 500-pound gorilla was the symphony. He had not yet written a symphony. Now, one of the reasons everybody was so keen on him was the fact that the symphony as a genre, as of the 1870s, was in dire condition. It was in dire straits. One of the ways to think about it is just to look at the number of symphonies that were published in Austria and Germany in the years following Beethoven. Now, remember, Beethoven's last symphony had been in the 1820s, and that had been sort of the capstone of symphonic development up to that point. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. So it seemed to a lot of people that Beethoven, who had been such a great symphonist, had pretty much capped off the symphony as a genre. You know, who can continue after that? I wouldn't want to be a composer trying to, do that, right? Or maybe they could go off in some whole altogether new direction with the symphony, but what's to be done? So let us just look at this little chart here. Now, 1809 through 1820, I'm sorry, my numbers are off. That's really a very misleading statistic there, isn't it? 1809 to 1820, there were 50 symphonies published. That's quite a bit, isn't it? Given that they were all hand-copied out and so on. But look what happens in the next decades. 30 to 39, only 20. 40 to 49, only 23. And 50 to 59, only 19. Published, right? And so that's not very many. And this is not to say that they were all world-beating symphonies either. In fact, they weren't any of them really to speak of outside of a very few. The whole production of symphonies had dropped. Here's the names of some of the people who were publishing those symphonies. Goldmark, Volkmann, Reinberger, Reinecke, Gersheim, Raff, and Draeseke. Household names all. At least in their own households, right? So some of these were actually very well respected in the day. Reinecke, for example, Karl Reinecke was also a pianist who trained a lot of students who went on to study with Liszt, for example. Raff was very highly thought of in the day, as was, by the way, Draeseke. But now, of course, how many of you have heard a symphony by any one of these guys? A few hands, bravo. Okay, bravo, pretty good. That's more listeners than they probably had in the last century. Now, here's an example. The works were mostly Mendelssohn or Schumann-esque types. That's what they were copying, because the Mendelssohn and Schumann symphonies had done well. And so this is one by Felix Draeseke, and it's pure Mendelssohn knockoff. Now, one point about Felix Draeseke I would like to make is that I do believe he was the possessor of the ugliest beard in the history of music. Doesn't it look like he's eating some small animal or something? I mean, how do you tell somebody, Felix, you're a great guy, but that beard, man. But the fact is, he was quite a good composer if you're okay with stuff that sounds like warmed over Mendelssohn. That's enough. All right. I had a teacher, once a piano teacher, who would always talk about, Scott, it's like fairies and Mendelssohn, and that's what that is. So now, what was leading into a lot of this? Well, one thing was actually a great boon that had a dark side to it, and the great boon was the foundation of the civic orchestras, the big civic orchestras. That is the orchestra that bears a town name, kind of like a football team, right? And so on. There had been a few, Leipzig, the Gewandhaus, which was older, Dresden, London had had a few, but now with the foundation of the Vienna Philharmonic, the Berlin Philharmonic, the Hamburg, Munich, Prague, Warsaw, and before you knew it, New York, Boston, so on, these city orchestras, okay, the big city orchestras with subscription concerts. Well, they were a mid-19th century phenomenon for the most part. They started popping up all over Europe bit by bit. Many of them were subscription-based, so you just bought the season, which was usually 4 or 5 concerts maximum. Many of them were employee-owned, that is, that the players themselves managed the orchestra. Vienna Philharmonic is like that to this day, in fact, so on. And they had an enormous impact on musical taste and musical expectations because they brought about a sea change in the way we hear music and the way we experience it. You have to think about what it was like to be a music lover in one of these big European cities in the mid to early 19th century. Let's say mid 1850. Now, you have heard all about these Beethoven symphonies that everybody says are so cool. But what are your chances of actually hearing one? Zip. Because if you don't have an orchestra in your city, which could be Paris, by the way, how are you going to hear them? No radio, no records, no YouTube. Now you could buy a copy of the music, a score, and you could, dink it out on the piano, depending on how good your score reading is, right? You could buy 2 piano versions, piano 4-hand versions, and do it that way. But you could not hear an orchestra play it. And if you were lucky, these orchestras that came along, say the Vienna Philharmonic, well, they only played about 4 concerts a year. So in other words, you have a chance maybe to hear the Eroica once or twice in your lifetime. Maybe the 9th century would be a life experience for you of Beethoven, right? It would be, you'd only hear it once in your whole life. This is why a lot of these listeners of this era seem to be able to get so much out of one hearing of a piece. These writers who write these brilliant analyses of pieces on one performance because they were trained to really get the pith of it on one hearing because they couldn't hear it again. Unless you were just made out of money and you could go to concerts all the time, but they weren't there to go to. So we have to realize how different it was. So what does this mean then? Let's say you live in Vienna and you've got the Vienna Philharmonic starting up and you have the means to go to concerts. What do you want them to play? Beethoven. You see, this is what you want to hear, is you want to hear this stuff you've been hearing about. So it was about this point, right around the middle of the 19th century, that a new concept started up. That concept is what we now call the standard repertory. The stuff that we all expect people to play, orchestras to know, those core pieces. That began. This is also around the time that the notion of the great composer begins to come up and music appreciation starts becoming an ongoing thing. I'm happy about that. And so these are the pieces that everybody wanted to hear, the musicians rated most highly, and that there was the greatest hunger among audiences to really get to know. The professionals knew the pieces, but us, you and I, didn't. So they really wanted to hear these. Well, Among slightly newer pieces, Mendelssohn's symphonies made it in the repertory quickly. They became repertory items, as did Schumann's very quickly. And also Louis Spohr's. He's another one who was big in the day. Now we've kind of forgotten. Good composer, a little bourgeois, but good. And the notion of a standard symphonic repertory, what it came to mean, Mozart's later symphonies, 35 through 41, just as they are now, some of the later Haydn's, the London symphonies, a few of those. And above all, it meant him. Da ya ta ti ta yan da 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 ya da 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 ti da ti da da da. Oh, I say, but this is what it meant. It meant to hear Beethoven. That's what they all wanted to hear, wouldn't you? So let's not here talk about conservative symphony audiences, because they had a right to be. They were dying to hear all this stuff, and so of course the orchestras were only too happy to play it. After all, that's what packed them in, still does. So they were faced with the sheer immensity of the music of the immediate past, faced with that incredible immensity. So their attitude towards brand new symphonies by somebody they'd never heard of, their attitude towards new music, even though that huge gap between audience and composer had not yet opened, their attitude could be summed up as something like this. Oh, I had to look hard for that picture. Yeah. Plus ça change, plus la même chose, right? It really has. So there we are. Yes, and so this is the way they felt about all that new stuff. They wanted to hear Beethoven, and so on. They really did. So therefore, the general attitude. Sad. It's fun while it lasted. It's all over now. And there was a real feeling that the symphony had become a museum piece, the symphony as a genre. People were writing symphonies as graduation pieces. That was like from a conservatory. And for prestige, because everybody had to write one, and so on. But that's it. I mean, they wrote it. It got played once by the school orchestra, and that was the end of that, so on. So for some composers, they were thinking, well, okay, fine. All right, fine. The symphony as this unified, organic, four-movement composition, abstract music, that's not working anymore. So let's take it in some new directions. Let's go off in some new directions. Why don't we go back to the word symphony in its original meaning? Sim, together, phonia, sound. It doesn't have to mean a four-movement piece that's abstract a la Beethoven. Let's write something and just call it a symphony. Using that older meaning of the word. Well, that started happening shortly even after Beethoven died. One of the very first works that uses the word symphony in this very loose term is by Berlioz. This came about 3 years after Beethoven's death. It's the Symphonie Fantastique, the Symphony of Fantasy, the Fantastic Symphony. It tells a story. It's got a plot. It tells of a young artist's doomed love for an unobtainable young lady. So a little actress he was in love with at the time, Harriet Smithson. And eventually, in his fantasy, he murders her. He's carted off to the guillotine. We even have the sound of the blade falling and getting his head, and you hear it go bonk, 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 And then in the last movement, he is the center of attention for a black mass and a witch's Sabbath. Blasphemy. France, 1830s. Oh boy, it must have been fun. It's very much cool. Not the sort of thing Beethoven had in mind for a symphony, even with the Pastoral Symphony, which was kind of programmatic, and musically it had nothing to do with Beethoven whatsoever. The Dies Irae. Oh. Whole new direction for the symphony. And that kicked off a bunch of ideas about, well, let's make the symphony into a more theatrical thing. It's almost like a theater piece without theater, if you will. Another person who carried on from this brilliantly, whether you like his music or not, it was brilliant, was Liszt. And in his Faust symphony, he tapped into Faust again. Everybody was doing Faust in the 19th century, right? It was a Faust crazy era. And the selling of the soul to the devil. And the Faust symphony, it has vocal parts in it, which is a bit of a nod to Beethoven in the Ninth Symphony. It's also a nod to opera. And this is a very operatic symphony. It's a very theatrical symphony. And if you can imagine this being the music for a big fancy stage spectacle, ballet and theatrical effects, it's not. I mean, it's just symphonic. But you can see that in your mind when you hear it, because this music is wonderful in its own way. It's kind of gaudy and very, very theatrical. Wow. It's not Beethoven. Very different, yet it has the word symphony. So we reach about mid-century, a little past, and we're in a situation where we've got retreads. We've got Mendelssohn and Schumann retreads, attempts to write Beethoven. One of Beethoven's students, Ferdinand Ries, he wrote a symphony that actually goes, ya-da-da-dum. Guy, come on, it's been done. It's so odd. And then you got all that stuff, these sort of wan retreads, and then you've got all this stuff, which was very exciting, and all that. But it meant that there was nothing in the middle where the grand, abstract symphony a la Beethoven was making any forward motion. It seemed to have stopped with about Schumann, which was right around mid-century. And Schumann, as you know, was a latecomer to the symphonic thing. So our guy, he came of age, remember, in the 1850s. This was his time when he met the Schumanns and came of age. He came of age right at the worst time for the symphony. The symphony was in its deepest and darkest decline around that. And I think in spite of that and because of that, one of the first things that started happening when he met Robert Schumann, fatefully, was that both Robert and Clara started getting on him to write a symphony. They could tell from his sonatas that he had played for him, like the big C major sonata that he played for them, that this guy had the goods to do it. He already as a young man did, and as he continued to develop, that just became more and more obvious. If anybody was going to rescue the symphony, the Beethovenian symphony, he's the one. He knew that. And it was a terrible burden. 1854, he's 21 years old. He started trying to write a symphony. Now, yes, Mozart did it when he was 8, but he was Mozart. And the symphony was very different back then. It was a much lighter weight affair. So writing a symphony for Mozart meant writing a symphony. For Brahms, it meant writing a symphony. There's a great deal of difference. He kept trying, though. And as a matter of fact, as we've talked here in the class, a number of his early compositions bear the evidence of those early symphonic efforts, because he would recycle music that had originally been part of a symphony and turn it into something else. Probably the most dramatic of those is his first piano concerto. As remember, I told you it was booed in Leipzig at its premiere. Well, the first movement in particular of that concerto was originally targeted as a symphonic movement. He was going to write a great D minor symphony in honor of Beethoven. The Ninth Symphony is in D minor. And eventually he simply could not get it to work as a symphony, which isn't surprising. He was, at that point, really a little young to handle that. So it became the first piano concerto. Now, what's interesting is when you hear the opening of that concerto, it does not sound like a concerto. It sounds like the opening of a great, weighty symphony. That's a symphony. It's got that wonderful, great demeanor of symphonic language. The fact is, eventually the piano comes in and it becomes a concerto. It's the first of the Brahms symphonies that never happened. Now, remember I told you in the late 1850s, for 3 seasons, he had a job in the court of Detmold, where he was the Kapellmeister there. And during that time, he wrote 2 serenades. Originally for small chamber groups, he then expanded them out for full orchestra, especially the first one in D major, which became a work for full orchestra. Now, it's a suite. It's got a bunch of short dance-like movements. But remember, I played for you the entire slow movement, the adagio of that. That could be a symphonic movement. It's the one movement in the piece that could be. Because I told you that's my go-to piece when I'm feeling blue. You know, that and a big piece of cheesecake, it's just all I need, really. And in a way, as a proto-symphony, you see it's him sort of, trying his wings a little bit. Now, he had a roadblock, and that concerned the orchestra. He was not ever trained in orchestration, writing for the orchestra, and he really didn't have any confidence in his own skill. His friend Joachim, the great violinist, in fact, when Brahms sent him the first orchestrated version of the piano concerto, Joachim burst out laughing right in front of him. So he was convinced that his skills just weren't up to the task of a symphony. So he really held off any commitment to a symphony until he was sure he had developed those skills. Brahms was a great technician, and I don't think he was going to be satisfied writing a symphony until not only had he mastered the orchestra, but he had developed his own style with the orchestra, so that he did not sound like everybody else and their brother. He needed to be his own orchestrator and make his own sound with the orchestra. That didn't really happen until he was pushing 40. He had plenty of time to develop, and in the early 1870s, he reached his goal, and that was in this extraordinary, marvelous, early maturity piece of his. The Variations on a Theme by Haydn, I've chosen what is to me an absolutely precious recording of it. It's new. Ivan Fischer and the Budapest Festival Orchestra. This is absolutely my go-to recording for this piece now. Marvelous. It's easily available. Channel Classics, very easy to get. The Haydn Variations are based on a chorale called the St. Anthony Chorale. Bum bidim bum ba di ya di lam da di da di da ti ya. That was often attributed to Haydn because Haydn used it in one of his chamber works. And for a lot of time, people thought it was by Haydn. It isn't. It's the St. Anthony Chorale. Brahms, who you remember, was making part of his living as a pianist, even as late as the 1870s. He was giving the occasional concert. And he created a glittering two-piano set of variations. Fabulous. And then later in 1873, he orchestrated it. At that point, he had it. This is where the real Brahms orchestra shows up. Big, rich, meaty, a lot of beautiful wind writing, very careful use of brass, elegant, gorgeous, flexible, but powerful. This is the Brahms orchestra. Brahms doesn't sound like anybody else. His orchestration sounds like him from this point on. It does. It also includes about the closest he ever got to having orchestral bling. He was not a blingy composer. He was not one to ask you to have mass chimes or cannons or the kitchen sink or whatever. About the closest he got to bling was the triangle. Right? He used it 3 times. The Academic Festival Overture, which is a jeu d'esprit. In the 4th Symphony, which is a very great serious work, and here in the Haydn variations. And so this is maximum bling for Brahms. And so he uses it very well. Very well. So we're going to hear the last group of variations. It's called Variation 19, but it's a whole bunch of short variations, one after another. And then the great peroration that comes into the end and brings back the chorale in all its glory. Great moment. And I thought that instead of just, the usual chart, I would just do pictures. And I don't know why this piece makes me think of the autumn, but it does. It's a very cheery piece. And I think part of it is because it's in B-flat major, and I associate B-flat with browns and reds and colors like that. But at any rate, I'm going to accompany it with autumn landscapes. And we're going to hear just this last part of it in what I think is an absolutely bewitching performance. Oh, he hit a home run with that piece, you know. It's just so enjoyable and uplifting and fun and beautiful and everything. And he got all the pieces together in this. He mastered the orchestra and became the great orchestrator that he was capable of being. So, John, when's the symphony gonna happen, huh, baby? People are starting to call it the 10th. Beethoven wrote 9, this is the 10th, right? Well, he had actually started it quite a bit earlier. Only a few people knew that. One of the people who knew that was Clara Schumann, of course, right? Clara, of course, who was always his, his sounding board, his closest musical friend. He sent her, she says to Joachim, Johannes sent me the other day, imagine the surprise, the first movement of a symphony with the following bold beginning. That is rather strong, but I have soon become used to it. The movement is full of wonderful beauties, and the themes are treated with a mastery which is becoming more and more characteristic of him. 1862. Now, what's fascinating about this, if you think you know this piece, here's the bold beginning to which she refers. Those of you who know the symphony may think that's not the beginning of the Brahms first. It's the beginning of the Allegro. Clara and Joachim talked him into writing an introduction. But as originally written, it was going to go ready, set, go, bang, like that. Well, but that was all. Anybody heard of it? That was the end of that for a while. Then in 1868, right in the middle of one of their periodic I'm never speaking to you again type tiffs, they had them all the time. As you know, I've told you Brahms was very high strung. So was Clara. But they loved each other. They always made up. He sent her a little sketch of a little alpine horn type theme he'd come up with. And he said, I'm just thinking of you. Happy birthday. And he sent this to her. It sounds like the Big Ben chimes as well. Okay, well, that was the end of that. It was just kind of there, hanging around there. She had no idea what he was going to do with it. What he did. Oh, baby. Well, years passed. Time passed. The symphony acquired that great grandiloquent Bachian opening that it eventually got, modeled on the St. John Passion. Then he wrote 2 more movements. They were fairly slender compared to this gigantic first movement. They were rather slender. They're beautiful. Very, very beautiful, but rather shorter, more gentle, and so on. Okay, fine. Gigantic, serious, huge first movement, 2 slender movements. He wasn't finished, obviously. It remained incomplete. What was taking so long? Well, what it was, of course, was the finale. How do you finish it? The ending, so important, so difficult. And if he stumbled writing this ending, it would ruin the symphony. He had to get it right. Had to. Also, if you consider that if he stumbled writing this symphony, that would probably be a terrible blow for him because everybody was expecting a consummate masterwork out of his first symphony. And so what if he didn't deliver? Would he ever have the nerve to write another symphony again? So it was all hinging on this movement. Now, for a long time, finales were simply not a problem. In the early symphony, as it developed, the symphony of Haydn's early years, of all of those early writers, all of the Mannheim people and so on, most symphonies were pretty lightweight anyway. They were background music. Many of the Mannheim symphonies were written to accompany card games, in the palace. And generally speaking, most finales, the idea of the finale was just kind of a kiss on the cheek and a fare thee well and have a good time sort of thing. just get an example. This is just out of the bazillion symphonies there are in the second half of the 18th century. This is a symphony by John Herschel, the guy that discovered Uranus, the astronomer. He was also a musician. Isn't that cool? And this is around 1760. This is the last movement of a symphony by him. Classic for the era. Well, just charming, isn't it? It's a good writer. So the idea of the finale was more sort of like the sorbet at the end of the dinner, right? You know, it was a little glass of champagne, and that was it. So on. So symphony finales tended to be the lightest movement of the three or four. Well, that started changing, of course. It had to. Haydn was the first person to begin bringing about a big change in that. His symphonies, starting with about the 1780s, the ones we call the Paris symphonies in that time, first, they had much bigger first movements, intensely structured and very, very strong movements. And Haydn, the master craftsman that he was, understood that you had to counterbalance that with a bigger finale as well. Otherwise, the thing became too front-loaded and so on. So it's many of the later Haydn symphonies, it's the last movement that's got all the zing in it. And sometimes they are the real tours de force of construction and so on. He even went so far as to begin using his last movement as a kind of a wrap-up of the previous three, where he'd start using references to his earlier movements, as he does, for example, in Symphony 100, where he starts bringing that back. The fact he was doing that was not lost on his young student, Ludwig van Beethoven. Beethoven learned a lot from Haydn, mostly just by listening to his music. And it was Beethoven who, in writing the symphony, began realizing that in a symphony, it doesn't need to be as front-loaded, it needs to be back-loaded. It was Beethoven who began really understanding that a symphony can be a dramatic entity. The symphony can carve out a dramatic arc. It can tell a story, a wordless story from beginning to end. In the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, of course, that famous first movement, right? Full of storm and stress. When it goes to its third movement, which is a rather spooky, slow scherzo, at the end of the movement, instead of stopping, it drops into that midnight of the soul moment where all hope is lost. And out of this moment erupts this phoenix of a finale. Wow! It's one of the greatest moments in all music. So, how could he top that? Well, he didn't try for a while until the Ninth Symphony, which has this enormous first movement. And then it has this brittle, magnificent scherzo movement and a slow movement to die for. What are you going to do for your finale, huh? He brings chorus in, vocal soloists in. He brings a Turkish band in. He brought the expressiveness of the human voice to the more mechanical aspects of an orchestra. And his setting of the Ode to Joy in the last movement haunted every composer of the 19th century because it is the finale to end all finales. It's not just that it was a grand thing to do, it was the right thing to do. You had to have a finale of this level to counterbalance the magnificence of the symphony that had preceded. Only like a cosmic thing would do. Beethoven being Beethoven, he could do cosmic. All right. We've heard it, but this is what Brahms was dealing with. Well, he didn't have to outdo Beethoven. That's silly, right? That's competition. That's not art. He didn't have to do that. But because he had that enormous first movement, which was beautiful as it was, he knew he had to counterbalance it with a finale that would be not only worthy of it, but would answer the rhetoric of the first movement, which is by and large very dark. He would have to do that. It had to answer the drama of the earlier part of the symphony, and that's what took so long. That's what he couldn't find his way to. But of course he did. But he wasn't going to rush it. He was going to take his sweet time. And he did. It didn't happen until 1876. So that's the full gestation of this symphony is about 22 years. Yeah. So the great big question, the $64,000 question is it worth it? Is it worth such a long wait? Yeah! Oh boy, is it ever! Let me tell you a few things about it. I'm not going to get too technical on you. You know I am a theory teacher, though. But a little bit of stuff that might help you understand some of the brilliance of this particular work. To begin with, it is built out of mirrored items, that is, things that go up, go down, and so on. For example, the four movements of the symphony. Well, the first movement starts in the key of C minor. Then we end that movement, and we move up the interval of a major third. Bum, bum. And the next movement is in E major. Then having gotten to the end of that movement, we move up another major third. Yum, ba, to the key of A flat major. And then if we move up one more major third, yum, ba, we wind up back in C again. And this time, though, he starts it in C minor, and then it goes to C major. So he mirrors the C minor of the first movement with the C major of the last, which is much as Beethoven does in the fifth. And all of it moving by thirds. Brahms being Brahms, the fact that there are thirds in the key structure means there are going to be thirds in all the melodies as well. Everything will be organically unified. Nothing will be accidental. There is no seat of the pants writing in this guy. Ever. One of the things we hear right at the beginning of the symphony is a chromatic scale. Ya, ba, 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 that sort of sound. That turns out to be very important. The first thing we hear, that introduction that he wrote that Clara talked him into writing. Da, 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 da. Right at the beginning. Ya, pa, pa, that idea, well, that becomes the primary theme of the movement after the introduction. Da, da, da. Yeah. Yeah. And then the end of the theme, instead of going up chromatically, ya, da, da, it goes down. Of course. Mirroring, right? Right? It has followed. All these thirds that happen all the way through these, ya-dum, be-dum, be-dum, are often answered by six, which is the upside-down version of a third. Ya-bum, ba-bum, the six. And that happens all the time in this piece because thirds are where it's at in this symphony. Ba-bum, ba-ba, ba-bum. Now, those are the thirds. Yeah-yum, ya-yum. The whole thing is built out of these initial ideas. If you really follow it through, listen to the first 5 measures of the symphony and you know how the rest is going to go. Absolutely amazing. The mirroring idea, very important throughout the symphony. Things that go up, go down, and sometimes they do it at the same time. I love that. Here's the opening again, and I have a little chart to help you. Here we go. And so on. Isn't that cool? Let's do that again. Da, 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 ta, ta, ta. This piece is it's structured like a Swiss tank. There's not an extra note in it anywhere. You take one note away and the whole is diminished. And yet it's huge. Great big huge thing. So, first movement is so big, I'm not going to play the whole first movement. What I'm going to play for you is the introduction and the exposition, the first third of the sonata form. All righty? This is a particularly marvelous performance. This is live. It's our wonderful American conductor, James Levine, in front of the Vienna Philharmonic, who, of course, collectively consider that they own this piece. And they have every right to think that, too. So live in the Golden Hall of the Musikverein, Levine and the Vienna Philharmonic playing their collective hearts out in this incredible symphony. I have a chart for you. It just shows the main divisions. Here we go. Six. Things going down. Chromatics. Again. Chromatics. Then a transition back to the mood of the opening. The thirds go up now. Ita, ita, ta, ti, ta. And then back to the opening. Transition. Where's it going? What's going to happen? Primary theme. falling ideas. Ta 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 ta. Moving forward. Sped up version of something you've heard before. Pa-pum, 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 pa-pum. And our secondary theme is on the way. Lyric. Dee-dee-dum. What's going to happen? Closing. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Thirds. Ta-ta. A third. A third. A third. A third. A third. And then we go on. Now, before we take our break, I never really give you assignments, but I'm going to give you one now. You won't be tested on it or anything. But I'm going to suggest that you listen to the symphony at home if you have a recording of it, and if you don't, shame on you, go get one. So on. And listen to this part of it until you can hear that all of the major materials, the primary theme, the secondary theme, and the closing theme, are one and the same. He does such a great job of masking that you can't quite tell when you first hear it. But they are actually the same theme throughout. It's like the way Haydn wrote and the way Beethoven wrote. And nobody else in Europe had the skill to do until Brahms came along. That's one of the reasons it sounds so inevitable. Then listen to it for thirds. Listen to it for chromatics. It's like peeling the layers off an onion. Except this onion has infinite layers. You're never going to run out. Speaking of running out, go run out and take your break. I'd like to have you back at 11:05 and 12 seconds, please. Thank you very much. All right. Well, we've got a lot of ground to cover because I'm not going to do an excerpt to the fourth movement. I'm going to give you the whole enchilada. Now, the second and third movements are glorious and wonderful, as I said, lighter weight, slower movements, wonderful things. Especially the slow movements got one of the great solo violin parts there ever was. But that fourth movement that he worked on so hard, well, I'm choosing a von Karajan's Berlin Philharmonic recording from 1978. It's the second of his 3 recordings, and I personally think it's the best. They're all good. But I think somehow he really gets this really well. And they do. Of course, they play it gorgeously. Now, the thing about this last movement is that it opens up in limbo. I like to think of it as that moment of shock after maybe a revelation, a tragic revelation, an accident. That moment when the mind just can't accept what's happened. That seems to be the mood of it at the opening. You don't know it, but you've just heard a preview of the main theme of the movement. But you can't know that yet. Now, in the aftermath of that, as the shock, of course, wears off, what arises is energy, anger, a sense of almost desperation, and so on that would happen, right? And it's sounding as though this is going to be a movement full of angst, a movement full of trouble and angst and conflict. But then comes one of the great moments in all music. The conflict ends, the bang, and out of that conflict comes the light. A great, magnificent dawning, the Alpine horn theme comes in for the first time. And from that moment on, it's sunshine the whole way, pretty much. That gives way to the beginning of the Allegro proper, the sonata form proper. And for that, the primary theme, which is a very conscious tribute to Beethoven, there's no question. The resemblance to the Ode to Joy is deliberate. It's not copycat. It is Brahms, I think, acknowledging everything that everybody had said, that this was going to be the 10th symphony. It's also his way of saying, this beautiful chorale-like moment, this beautiful movement, this beautiful melody, it's noble. It's not all joyous the way the Beethoven Ode to Joy is. This is more noble and all-expansive. And I should tell you, it's made up out of chromatic motions and thirds. You'll hear the rest in a moment. Now, the movement that follows, the great Allegro movement, it's about 18 minutes long, is written in classical sonata form, the way the first movement is. Just a quick reminder, that's exposition, which has a primary theme, transition, secondary theme, closing theme, followed by development, which mixes and matches everything, and then a recapitulation in which the primary theme, transition, secondary themes come back, but now all resolved back into the original key in which they began. Now this is classic sonata form, this movement, except that he omits the middle section, the development. That's not unheard of. There's a lot of pieces that do this. The Overture to the Marriage of Figaro, for example, does this. So on. It enables him to kind of get to the business at hand more quickly. Now to counterbalance that, though, because that does lead to a bit of imbalance, first there's a long introduction, everything up through the Alpine horn theme, and there's a glorious, radiant coda. Now, to give you a chart for this movement, I decided I was going to kind of go the whole hog for this. And so I've done a very detailed chart on this, in which each screenful is devoted to a specific melody and section. Now, one thing you haven't seen too often, I just remind you in these charts, I use P for the primary theme, T for the transitional, S for secondary, and K for closing. And there's also, you're going to find an O theme in here at the beginning. Those are introductory themes. introductory. Oh, and they're all color coordinated, of course. Me being me, of course, right? O themes are all green, by the way. There are 5 of those. So you'll see like 1-0, 2-0, 3-0, 4-0, 5-0. That's what those are. Then all the various, there are 2 primary themes. There's transitional themes, secondary themes, closing themes. All of them have a page to themselves up here, and I'm using text labels to help you. What's interesting is that even with this, I still had to stay a little bit coarse in the analysis. There are close to 60 events documented in this chart, and yet it's still a little coarse. Left to my own incredibly anal retentive self, it would probably be about 200 events, so on, and I'd still be working on the chart now. But as it is, it's quite detailed. I don't do charts this detailed very often, but for this movement, oh yes. Oh yes. So, ready? Here we go. Flutes. next theme, you hear it, try to remember it. It's going to come back later. It's going to be a while. Here it is. And then the alpine horn comes back. Lead into the main body of the movement. Now. Hi, Mary. Continues. Repeats with the winds. Now we stretch it out. It builds. Full orchestra. Moving. Second theme. First secondary theme. Now, a new theme, coming in a moment. Building up to. And. Now, they move on. More now. Stretch them out. One, two, three, one. 1, 2, 3, 1. Triple it, triple it, triple it, triple it. The T, the front, 5. Bum, bum, bum. And a moment of and to the recap. Notice it changes key to E flat major. D dot yum. That's back to the introduction. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dee, dot. The whole point here is when the primary theme comes back, it sounds fresh. And transitions. N means new theme. The horn comes back. Reaches the secondary themes, he's going to more or less copy the exposition. Here he's been departing quite a bit, but here we go. There we go. And now leads on quite a bit. Triplets are in there. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-bum. Ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-bum. Ba-ba-ba-ba. Ba-ba-ba-bum. Ba-da-ba-bum. 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 Now, technically speaking, that's the end of the movement. So, long transition. Lots of references. Dee-dee-da-dee. Dee-da-da-dee. Builds up. Speeds up. Ba-da-bum, 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 ba-da-bum. Remember that chorale theme? Here it is. Right at the end. And then take it home. $22 worth every minute. Just the part of the fun of it, I mean, again, if you listen to it again and again, that thing right at the end when the orchestra starts going, ya, da, yum, bum, bada bum, like that, that's the first movement. It's the end of the primary theme in the first movement. I mean, the whole thing is just, like this. You can get, it's like following the rabbit down the hole, and so on. But the fact is, it's endlessly fascinating. Well, it was a success d'estime. A lot of people were fascinated by it. I think a lot of people didn't like it all that much. I think they're like, it's awfully complicated, But it caught on very quickly. And what it did more than anything else is that it kicked off what we now call the second golden age of the Viennese Symphony. It did everything everybody had hoped it would do. It made it safe to start writing symphonies again and getting them taken seriously. It had already started a little bit, but in its heels comes Dvorak, all of his symphonies, Tchaikovsky, the Russians, Bruckner. But the biggest and happiest recipient was Brahms himself. Because right on the heels of this, a year later, he gave us another symphony. Yeah, and that will be part of our discussion next week. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.